Thank you, Crystal, for introducing. So what I want to do before I sort of frame social media and organizations is just talk to you a little bit about some of the nuts and bolts of the conference in addition to the live stream. So definitely please follow along on Twitter with the hashtag. Some of you have asked about Wi-Fi, and you can log in. It should work via Bowdoin Guest. I think Nathan and PJ, you were able to access things using that. So you can get online, and obviously feel free to collaboratively tweet or use the internet in any way you need to. The way we've organized the sessions today, we've tried to put together things based around theory, based around empirical work, as well as based around student work. And I just want to talk about the last thing first. My students from social media class I'm teaching this semester have done amazing posters, which are in the room right over there in main lounge. And they've done them in groups of 2 using social network analysis and NodeXL. For those of you who are not familiar with NodeXL, it's a computational social scientific piece of software that's a plugin into Excel. You can pull down data from Twitter, Facebook, other social media, and do analysis. So sort of the culmination of the day in a way is to also engage students and have them, who will be coming throughout the day, be able to also present their work, but obviously not have to come up and feel very stressed, but can sort of present from their poster work. Starting out the day, we're going to talk a lot about the theory around online collaboration via social media through virtual teams. And Nicole Ellison and Matt Weber are going to be presenting a paper called The Role of Social Media for Knowledge Sharing and Collaboration of Distributed Teams. Jennifer Earle will be presenting on the future of social movement organizations, the waning dominance of SMOs online, and I'll be framing things to sort of get us started off. After we have a nice lunch of Bowdoin dining, as long as they live up to the promises that Crystal has given us, we'll then start going into some more empirical work with Peter Glure and colleagues from MIT with this paper, Measuring Creative Performance of Teams Through Dynamic Semantic Social Network Analysis. So similar methods to what the students are using. And then afterwards, we dip back into theory for a second with the new prosumer, collaboration on the digital material new means of prosumption with George Ritzer. His graduate students, PJ Ray and Nathan Jurgensen, will be presenting Virtual Communities Don't Exist, Avoiding Digital Dualism and Studying Collaboration. And then in the afternoon, we do get wholly empirical at that point with Jing Wang's paper, Microblogging Practices of Virtual Organizations, Commonalities and Contrasts. Steve Jones will be Skyping in, so we truly are using social media at this point, and they're already live streamed in right now, which is why we set up the live stream so that Steve can come in for a very short paper. He's probably going to present for 10 minutes via Skype because it's sometimes harder to engage for a longer time, and we'll do a couple of minutes of Q&A. Alex Primo is then Skyping in from Brazil for another quick talk with the organization reinvented by its blogs. And we'll conclude that session with Jeff Treem, who is not Skyping in. Thank you, Jeff. Not that Skyping in is bad. With social media as technologies of accountability, explaining resistance to implementation within organizations. And we'll be finishing off with the student session that I had mentioned. Any questions that people had in terms of logistics or anything else? Okay, I'm going to launch straight in then to just have to find, I think we've got it right here. Yep. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do, just because people are coming from quite a diverse background, is very briefly frame some of the topics that I envisioned when I put together this small conference. Another thing that I should mention is the papers from this conference, subject to full peer reviewing, et cetera, will be published in 2 special issues, one with the American Behavioral Scientists Journal and the other with the International Journal of Organizations and Design Engineering. So, and that's partially because of some papers being theory and some papers being empirical. So the papers will eventually be also provided in that form. We also have a open access digital commons site, which during the conference you can access any of the papers at. The link, if you Google COSM2013 Bowdoin College, and you go to individual papers within the schedule, you can download the PDF slides of any of the talks. So they're already up there, and you don't have to necessarily frantically take notes of all the slides. It's my one thing I should say before talking about this. Okay, a couple of the things that I wanted to discuss, again, because many of you are coming from different backgrounds, is how to frame collaborative organizations in social media. Obviously, one of the things that first comes to mind is the global reach of social media and its potential for collaborations and people engaging in all sorts of collaborative activities. Cost efficiency, a big reason why a lot of organizations now are, and organizational movements and other organizational groupings are thinking about social media where they wouldn't have thought of social media before, is at least a perceived cost efficiency. Even if there isn't a cost efficiency, there is a perception that social media, because a lot of it is free, that it should be a means of communication that's evaluated for the use of any sort of movement or organizational setting. Another huge question, especially as a sociologist, which I've been very interested in, I put a question mark here very purposefully, is that it's potentially democratizing. The argument that if you organize things or if you try to collaborate via tools such as Facebook or Twitter or create Vines, etc., or Instagram with people collaboratively, that this is all potentially democratizing. You could be flattening all sorts of existing power relations and hierarchies and getting people to integrate in lots of ways. A famous example, and a lot of work has been done in this area by Axel Bruns and other people, and George Ritzer has done some work on this with this work of prosumption, is the idea that news production now, the blurring between the journalistic producer and the passive audience news consumer has been blurred quite a bit, and that people are collaboratively creating news, and Twitter is a big example of this. So potentially democratizing, that's an area I know the papers are definitely engaging with today. That it fosters increased innovation. At a lot of business schools, there's always talk of whether social media can be used to increase innovation. There's a lot of established metrics for measuring innovation. I know Peter Gluur's work from MIT looks at some of these measurements, and some arguments are made that Twitter, if you use Twitter, that's not going to get you any increases in innovation. And we were just talking about this yesterday, but that potentially if you use Facebook or email or other technologically mediated forms, you could get higher payoffs in innovation. So one of the things I hope we can engage with today, and that is definitely present in the literature, is that social media could potentially be fostering increased innovation. One of the other areas I think that's important to think about is potentially successful cases of social media use in organizational settings. And I put a couple of things up here. There's a lot of literature in virtual learning environments, VLEs. A lot of people also talk about MOOCs, the massive online learning environments. And one of the arguments is that there's collaborative learning that occurs in these spaces. So people are not only grading each other's papers, but they're engaging in forums and tweets and Facebook groups with each other, and they're discussing diverse ideas. I had a group of my senior students yesterday in here, and we're talking about social media, and one of them said, it would be really interesting for students at Bowdoin to engage in some of these massive virtual learning environments because they'd be exposed to views of people who are extremely diverse to them that they wouldn't normally come across on campus. So potentially could you have collaborative learning, and a lot of the literature examines that. Music production is another area which has been quite established in literature in terms of musicians collaborating. Again, the cost efficiency and global reach are also pretty persuasive in these instances. Again, a lot of these you can put question marks after. It's just sort of framing areas for discussion today. Software development and virtual teams. The open source movement has been highly documented, and a lot of people have talked about the development of Firefox and the Mozilla Foundation and other very popular tools. The big one is Apache, that runs a lot of the internet in terms of web servers. That these huge open source movements have been going on, and a lot of that well, actually not a lot, almost all of it is done collaboratively online in virtual teams, and much of it now is moving also towards social media, so using synchronous social media to foster some innovation and breakthroughs in terms of how to solve problems. Again, question marks potentially on all of this, but what is the role of social media in these organizational settings? One of the things that we need to think about in terms of thinking of the state of the field of social media and organizations, again, thinking spanning from business settings to Occupy Wall Street and organizational settings in that way, to the organization of racial movements and anti-racist movements. There's a lot of areas that we can think about in terms of collaboration and social media and organizations. And the key thing that we need to remember is this is a field in its infancy. Which is why I wanted to bring you guys together, is that we have a real potential here to make impact in literature and to think through big issues which really are still unsolved right now. We're also weak in theoretical development. There's a lot of stabs that people are doing and have been going on for years. If we think about when Twitter first came out, there were people already collecting massive data sets, pulling from the Twitter API or doing screen scrapes of Twitter data and trying to do big analysis with big data. What kind of was trailing in the background was theoretical intervention. So people trying to create theoretical scaffolding from across the disciplines, from humanities, from social sciences, and it's really catching up. So one of my intentions in bringing people together here was to also make sure that we presented a lot of theoretical material for us to think about, and not just think about the empirical, but think about the intersections in between. And I think what's happened is sometimes we have disconnected empirical work that isn't engaging in theory building, and theory building that isn't also fueling empirical development. So to try to bring together theoreticians and empiricists as well. And I think we're quite also, even though the field is weak in its infancy, we're also quite established in terms of social media and organizations and understanding of social movements, for example. There's been a lot of work, partially fueled by journalists, in terms of the Arab Spring. A lot of academics have also come forward to think about those ideas quite a bit. And there's more, let's say, of an establishment of literature in some of those areas than some other areas. So that's another thing I think that's important to think about, and what some of the papers today are also going to engage with. Specifically, I'm thinking of General's paper later today. Another thing I think that's important to highlight about social media and organizations is also some of the disciplinary domains sometimes it ends up being caught in. And I purposely put the acronyms up here so that non-HCI, non-human computer interaction, and CSCW, computer-supported collaborative work, those fields, right, have already bought the drug in terms of that social media has a lot of potential in terms of collaboration. But if you talk to people, for example, if you talk to people at the NSF, it depends directorate. Again, there's some directorates that think, no, social media, it's just for entertainment. And there's a lot of disciplinary areas that also see social media more as entertainment, and they don't necessarily see the value of it from a tool for collaboration, a tool for innovation, a tool for bringing people together in movements. And I think that's important for us to think about what its potentiality for serious collaboration is. Again, question mark. Maybe it is not a serious tool. Maybe tweets are pretty useless for collaboration. Maybe you have to have strong ties in order to activate collaboration. Or maybe weak tie networking that Twitter facilitates is good enough. Or maybe the latent ties that get activated by Twitter can foster serious collaboration. All big issues that we need to think about seriously, again, theoretically and empirically. And I think there's a need to critically think about the argument that I put up here from Turner, and I've got the references cited at the end, of ecologies of communication. So I quite like his idea that we have this ecological space. It kind of draws from Agamben's ideas of ecosystems and ambient environments, and Hermida writes about this as well, that we have these ecologies of communication that have all sorts of different types of communication mediums that are existing, and we use them for different things. And I think that we often forget that different communication mediums are optimized for different tasks. And in an ecology, we have these things functioning together. So we may make phone calls, we may be instant messaging, we may be emailing, we may be blogging, we may be Facebooking, we may be tweeting, we may be going crazy. But the whole thing is we have this space of an ecological ecosystem almost of different communications medium. And Nathan, who will be presenting later, Nathan Jurgensen, makes an argument of that these communication mediums can augment each other, rather than some of the arguments we see in popular journalism saying, if people are always tweeting all the time, which my research shows isn't necessarily the case. They do it in bursty activity, and it's not just tweet, 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 till they crash into a tree. But what Nathan's argument is, for example, is they can be additive, that they can augment each other, and that's something we need to think about. And I think that speaks well to Turner's argument as well. My own work, at least partially, has looked at collaboration by Twitter, and I've titled the slide Collaboration by Tweet. And I've looked a lot at scientific collaboration, and mainly looking at life scientists and whether Twitter has been able to foster meaningful collaboration and innovation between them. And one of the things I found in my research is that Twitter seems to be particularly useful for fleshing out ideas. So you can throw things out into the Twitterverse and say, what do you think about this? Do you think this is a worthwhile project? Or what would be some data sets that would be useful? Or what methods may I think about? And latent ties could be activated. That could potentially be helpful for us framing these arguments. And one of the things that's been quite fascinating observing, again, I haven't included any of this work, is that you may find potential collaborators out there on Twitter that just become activated because you post these things and someone who isn't even following you or you follow comes through and says, oh, this is quite interesting. Or in terms of a movement, you could get people that are interested in your movement. Another thing I want to throw up, and again, it's nothing I've fully researched in any way, is Twitter almost can be a beta testing or initial peer review of ideas. So you could have something you want to throw out to the Twitterverse and your colleagues who may be following you or you're following them and get initial feedback on. So it could be a staging area that could lead to publications. There's a lot of interesting talk amongst academics, and we were talking about this yesterday, whether there's any utility in scholars going on Twitter or other social media and talking about their work. Some people argue it's important from a public perspective that we can engage with the public. Others say there may be a net payoff because our work will be better, that people will engage with us. And other people say, no, there's nothing meaningful that could actually come from a critique from 140 characters. So again, another question mark, let's think about that. And could Twitter potentially provide input from senior figures who we don't want to contact by email? And I've had cases where students have @mentioned an author of a book they're reading in class. This has happened a bunch of times. And that author will actually @mention them back and they're floored. They go, oh, wow, this was neat. And they ask particular questions and say, on this page, I didn't understand what you said by that. And they @mention back. And you wouldn't, that person wouldn't respond to your email, but they responded to your tweet. Again, question mark, is there something from a collaborative part of breaking down hierarchies of ranks between academics, professor, and let's say untenured assistant professor, et cetera, that Twitter and other social media could potentially foster. I want to bring up an example, so I decided to just, again, beta test this. So this was involving me and something that just happened yesterday and the day before. I quickly collected some tweets. I collected 1,500 tweets over a period of a couple of days of the Great British Class Survey. And another of Accidental Racist, which was trending on Monday, which was a song by LL Cool J and Brad Paisley, which was completely scorned in the Twitterverse, as some people saying in the news media, being the worst song ever. So I started putting some blog posts up on my blog saying, I'm trying to think about these two very different incidents, like online, different trending topics, different ways of looking at all this data. So I was putting a couple of different things on my blog. And then, so I put up the accidental racist data, and I got a couple of social network analysis researchers in France who I wasn't following, and they weren't following me, but they read my blog post and started tons of tweets. And some of them just one after another with a 1 of 2, 2 of 2, and then there's other ones that even sort of rise up that I couldn't put on the slide. And he started making a lot of good points. I started amending my blog, adding things, and then tweeting back, and other people they knew sort of tweeted back, and I made changes. from my perspective, this is something interesting to think about, right? Even though there are 140 characters, they had an impact on the way I was looking at my work, and eventually will have a knock-on effect into how this paper turns out in the end. Again, I don't know how to exactly label what their collaborative level is. I mentioned some of them in the blog post as well, saying thanks to this person for your idea about that. So it's one of the things we need to think about in terms of our collaborative activity and what this could potentially mean. I do also want to talk about barriers to social media and collaboration, because I think it's all well and good to say, okay, we're putting up these tweets, okay, people around the world are collaborating with me, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Well, of course there's issues with any technological medium. Social media, like anything, is a technology. And I think some of the barriers which most of us are familiar with, but I think are worth flagging up, are a lack of technical knowledge, and I've cited one particular report, which is a tech project report, which comes from water utility companies. So basically, this is an organization of the American Water Works. Very, very exciting. I hope none of them are watching the live stream right now. But they're trying, basically they were in a budget crisis. All these water companies were saying, we're in a budget crisis. How can we foster collaboration with solving water utility problems? Big thing, all over the place, pipes are leaking. Right? We have so much water that gets wasted. And they have these really, really boring water committee meetings all over the place. And the water committees of all these different utilities and all these different regions don't necessarily talk to each other. And they all have the same problems, pretty much. So they say, yeah, I read through a bunch of their journal publications, got half catatonic at sometimes, but it basically, what you start seeing is that they have a lot of intersections in terms of their problems. So the argument that they funded a study, basically, these water boards, saying, what is it that we could potentially do that's cost effective because we're on a budget crisis? So they said, let's think about social media. Let's think about Twitter, wikis, blogs, Facebook, et cetera, because all of you are using these things, but then how could we integrate it? So they did this big study, and they found actually that 57% of people said they didn't have enough technical knowledge to tweet, Facebook, wiki, blog, et cetera. So they don't want to do it because of that. 41% said actually when they talked with their managers, their water utility companies, that there were prohibitive policies that said you can't use social media. And we know of a lot of settings, even some college campuses with some networks that try to limit various social media, but tons of businesses that do, saying if you're using social media at work, that's not productive. And the amount of time needed to manage social media was a big thing as well. And I omitted the percentage, but it was something around 20-something% in that report, saying people thought it would take too long to use social media to collaborate. Ultimately, they encouraged people to use social media, but they didn't know how to implement it from a policy perspective. They were confused because there were too many things prohibiting. There's a lot of conservatism in certain organizational contexts. I'm not saying that's bad or good, but for us to think about that as a barrier, that some organizations just feel that social media is not as good as face-to-face or other mediums, just pick up the phone if you want to collaborate, or just fly over and meet that person in person, or send them an email even. Intellectual property and copyright protection, a big issue in lots of different settings, especially if you're throwing up ideas on Twitter for a paper. Are there IP issues? Is someone going to steal your ideas? Someone could then take the data that I posted, write a cool paper on it, or think, hey, that's a great idea. Let's get our paper out first in a journal before Dhiraj Murthy does. And we'll cite his data, but we'll write the paper, right? And there's all sorts of issues of, well, if you do that, you're basically potentially causing issues, and they could watch your Twitter stream, see your approaches, see your methods, et cetera. So there's real issues that we need to think about, both from an academic point of view, as well as if you're, let's say, organizing a social movement, and people are seeing this, how about your opponents, so to speak, or your enemies? They're also going to see your strategizing and planning. Archival issues. We all know tweets are not easy to archive, and Twitter changes its API. And I know my students, as they were trying to pull tweets from old events, had problems, especially with Twitter changing its API right now. So it's almost like they disappear out of history, and we don't have all the tweets archived at the Library of Congress yet, so we don't have a way to necessarily get them. We go to Topsy, we go to other places. And what about Facebook? What about Instagram? We won't even talk about Snapchat. But all these things have ways of not necessarily, we know the internet has permanence of everything, but at the same time, it may be hard to find those digital objects, even if they exist somewhere. The last thing I sort of want to talk about here was the richness of media theory, the media richness theory. And again, not to say that I agree or disagree with this, but one of the theories of media richness is that there's a preference to face-to-face, and those of you familiar with Irving Goffman's work know sort of the great performativity, visual cues richness of seeing someone face-to-face, all of us seeing each other versus if we were watching the live stream, what would we get from this engagement? So is that a barrier that we need to critically think about with social media, that it's flattening a lot of communication, and then that reduces our potential for successful innovation, collaboration, etc.? I've just put up some references here, and I'll add all these slides to the proceedings. I don't actually have that slot in there, so I just have to put them a PDF up. So I'll get them up today, so you have those if you want to follow them along. But thank you all for coming, and I hope this presents a little bit of an introduction rather than diving straight into the papers. So the first paper we're going to have coming up is Nicole Ellison and Matt Weber, who will be talking about the role of social media for knowledge sharing and collaboration in distributed teams.